Awesome. So before I forget, what was the name of the restaurant in Detroit?
Revolver is closed now. It closed during the
Okay,
pandemic.
gotcha.
Yeah.
And what type of cuisine were you, or food were you serving there?
We didn't we had different chefs come in every
Okay,
weekend.
okay.
So that's why it was revolver, like a revolving um
Gotcha.
cast of
Gotcha.
chefs. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And then the new spot in New Orleans, what did you call that one?
Lagos.
Lagos.
Yeah. So that was the name of my dinner series before I opened up. My traveling dinner series before I settled in New Orleans was called Lagos. So I just kept the name.
Gotcha. So let's
Yeah.
get a little bit into when economic injustice, wealth disparities, all of this, you're starting to, as you're in the industry now and you're starting
Mhm.
to take notice, and maybe you took notice before, but now it's really becoming apparent of
Yeah.
what's going on. Tell me sort of when that sort of started creeping in and then just getting louder and louder and louder for you.
Yeah. So New Orleans was really I mean, my business failed in New Orleans very quickly.
Okay.
I'd raised some money. I got an investor, $10,000. I was losing. I lost that. The money was just dwindling. I had like a staff of five. The way the business was structured, the food hall was structured, I had to be open for inordinate hours, and so I had to staff it. And people weren't really enjoying my. They weren't really like fucking with my food, right? There was the food hall had
Hmm.
like 10 different vendors, and my food was traditional Nigerian food, fufu and stew that you eat like with your hands or with the fork if you wanted.
Hmm.
But like around me were like chicken sandwiches and salads and
Hmm.
smoothies and oysters, like so the
Hmm.
vibe did not support, at least in my opinion, did not support the kind of food that I was doing. So anyway, the
Okay.
business crashed after 6 months. I left the business and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I just, again, it was sort of like the period before I opened the food hall was sort of like repeated after I closed, and that I took some time to think about what I wanted to do. And instead of traveling, I just stayed put in New Orleans.
Okay.
Around this time, I was also dealing with like immigration stuff. I had
Hmm.
um, I had been arrested by immigration, and I was in detention, in deportation proceedings. I came out of that. I got out on bond, and so my legal case was pending.
Hmm.
Um, and when I closed the business, I just realized that like I didn't want to be confined anymore, and I wanted to
Hmm.
express myself and really use food as a way to express myself as opposed to use food as a way to make money and sell plates.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and I just started doing my own personal research on race in America. There wasn't like anything specifically that precipitated that. I came from. I didn't have the sort of racial consciousness that I developed in New Orleans, but I was interacting with work around race, like reading, like Franz Fanon, like before I was even cooking. It's just I like to read, so I was doing that kind of stuff. But after I left the restaurant in New Orleans, um, that was around the same time like Black Lives Matter had like popped off in like 2014 or 2013, I'm not sure. And
Hmm.
so that summer in 2015, there were a lot of activities around Black Lives Matter. So I started um, like investigating that stuff, for myself. I think it was also maybe around the time when they were looking to bring down the monuments.
Okay.
Um,
Hmm.
and I
The
had a friend,
Confederate. Hmm.
yeah, exactly. And I had a friend who is a brilliant woman, PhD. She's a scholar, but we had met through my food. Um, but then I had these questions around race that were coming up, and I knew that she was, that her work involved, studying race or at least talking about it. And so we would talk, and she really helped me. Her and her partner at the time helped me really like form my consciousness and started reading, some critical race theory stuff, like Alondra Nelson and um, the Combahee River Collective, and just all kinds of stuff on like race and blackness and Afrofuturism and all that
Hmm.
shit. And then I just decided like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. So
Okay.
in the spring of the next year, I decided to start a series called Blackness in America, where initially it was a chance for me to like understand what blackness was for me, but then it just became this space where we started talking about race.
Okay.
And then I became the facilitator of those conversations, and so I
Got it.
learned on the spot how to like facilitate conversations around race. Sometimes I didn't do it well enough. People people weren't happy with my conversation, with my facilitation style. Everybody
Hmm.
wanted to give me their opinion, but I just kept doing it. I kept thinking about race and food, and that work got attention. I mean, that the attention wasn't organic. I had to, I was sharing my work with the press and
Okay.
with community as a way to draw people into the dinners. And then once there were like one or two articles written about it in like big press, then
Hmm.
I started getting more um, uh, opportunities to do these dinners around the country. But then, when you start having conversations about racial disparity, what you're talking about is disparity. And the only way that you're able to appreciate disparities through the material circumstances of the folks that you're talking about. So the reason why I say blackness is problematized is because like black folks have don't have access to material resources, whether that's healthcare, education, or work or wealth. The access is different. There's a material difference in the access, um, and I began to focus on these disparities. Like hone in on them. Like there's because I remember having conversations with people in the room where the conversation eventually like touches on the disparity and then the choices that either um, reproduce those disparities
Hmm.
or could um, begin to to undo those disparities. And one conversation in particular I remember was uh, we were talking about education, um, and this is a very simplistic model that I drew, but basically public schools get funded based on a per pupil basis.
Hmm.
And so if you have wealthier or more affluent parents in a public school district that take their school out of that district into private school, say, then, you know, possibly the school is losing funding. So that was the framework that I posed. And this one white fellow, he said like he knows that, but he's not going to sacrifice his child's education for the
Right.
benefit of somebody else. And he was being honest. He wasn't like
Hmm.
being rude. And he was he's pro white man who was there to support black folks, and he was contending with this in public.
Hmm.
And um and so yeah, so I I wanted to think about ways where instead of talking about the disparity that existed as a function of, or as a consequence of race, that we could do something about it. We could create mechanisms to transfer those resources.
Hmm.
Um, and so I started off with like these more experimental projects where the disparity uh, was was brought to the forefront as opposed to in the background of the work. And so I think the most popular one that people know me for, at least know that project, was charging white people more
Hmm. For yeah.
for food based on the racial wealth disparity of I think in New Orleans it was like it was like what 1.5 times like white people make 1.5 times more than black people. Then I took that further by charging people based on the racial wealth disparity, which is 10 times, charging white people 10 times for food. And then I just kept like escalating those propositions. I
Hmm.
started selling. Did a project where I sold hot chicken for in exchange for home deeds that would
Okay.
then be transferred to black people.
Hmm.
But that project, I actually didn't get any home deeds, but somebody bought like a piece of chicken basically for like $100,000,
Oh,
which was
okay.
then, yeah, which we then used to seed this community land trust
Wow. Wow.
in Nashville. And then I did the salt project where, I charged $100 for salt
Hmm.
as a
And the
as a
salt was
repair.
called, I love the name of the salt it was
Uh,
called.
it was called Lot,
Okay.
LOT. Yeah. Um, and then I did another project called Baby Zoos where I was selling applesauce to hospital systems. We had one contract, and basically the money was supposed to, well, it wasn't supposed to. It actually did. The revenue from the sale of the applesauce went to Black women because we were talking about Black infant mortality in
Yeah.
Kalamazoo, Michigan. So
Yeah.
I started doing those kinds of projects as thinking about ways that you at least show a demonstration of what reparative um, arithmetic looks like. Um, and in this time, I was also learning a little bit more about the economic system
Okay.
and how it works. And I was also in this time uh, paying more attention to the global economic system and
Hmm.
how that works because I'm
Hmm.
Nigerian and
Hmm.
my folks are there. And so reading about economics, you know, I started subscribing to things like the Financial Times and those sorts of publications. And this one, you know, one article there sort of like set me off on a path. There was an interview with a woman named Stephanie Kelton,
Okay.
and she's one of many who are from the school of economic thought called modern monetary theory,
Okay.
MMT. And that reading that, and then reading another article called Other People's Blood, which sort of like connected um, the structural adjustment program in Nigeria. So this was in the 80s, what folks know as austerity, where a lot of African countries and third world countries got loans from the IMF in exchange for like restructuring their economy, and this restructuring was in favor of large corporations and to the detriment of working and middle class folks in Nigeria. Um, but that event, the IMF loans also coincided with the recession in the 70s in the United States. And that recession was I guess maybe the beginning, I think, in modern times of the decline of manufacturing
Okay.
in the US, but specifically the decline of automobile manufacturing in Michigan, where I lived in
Hmm.
Detroit.
Hmm.
So all of these things started to come together for me, and I was able to understand very in really fine detail that wealth and resource transfer, and then which is concerned with economic models and sort of economic mechanisms of wealth creation, labor and all sorts of things, and production. Those things are really at the mercy of finance.
Hmm.
You know, so thinking about money and capital um, is how I began to better understand the reasons why folks are dispossessed, whether you're black or you're working class or you're brown or you're indigenous or whatever. And so, excuse me, my work sort of evolved to start thinking about money as a tool of these different projects
Okay.
that exist, whether it's the colonial project, the neo-colonial project, or so like the the racist project, or I don't know, the racialization project, all sorts of like social projects that all the isms
Hmm.
in a way are influenced or underpinned by money. And so like the first thing that I did with that, I created these like imaginary tokens. I called it bullshit, and I did, yeah. And then I sold that to people. Some folks bought it. The idea was like, creating our own system of currency.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but finance is such a um, you know purposefully impermeable industry. It's hard to get in. It's hard to like really understand the the system is arcane. It's Byzantine. It's not. It's not. It's the barriers to entry are pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just spent as much as possible time thinking about finance, but also thinking about um, what that meant for Nigeria, where I'm from, because around this time too, I was able to start going home. My status
Yes,
was regularized.
2019, huh?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so I started going back home and like really, really like, I mean, I know I'm Nigerian, so I understand what was happening, but coming back home and seeing it from this new understanding that I had,
Mm-hmm.
this knowledge that the extractive relationships that exist create these conditions that we think are based on corruption or maladministration, but we don't. We refuse to see them as like structurally persistent.
Right,
The
right.
same way some folks would be like, well, black folks. I don't want to hire black folks because they don't have the right credentials or they're this or they're that. Those are symptomatic circumstances. The real, the structural issue which creates those symptoms are the system, and but the system is always purposefully obscured. And if you want to sort of tear away the disguise of the system, then you need to start learning a little bit more and penetrating um, these these circles and spaces. So spaces of finance and
Mm-hmm.
economics are really the two, in my mind, the two sort of spaces and the ideological underpinning of the dispossession that exists and
Right.
the
So treating the
lack
root
of,
and not the symptoms, and
yeah, those two spheres of social life, finance and economics, are where um, I think our problems are rooted. I mean,
wow.
the solutions can be in multiple places, but I think those two places are where they emanate from. And so I just been spending time reading and learning and trying. And then now, currently where I am now in 2023 is all
Mm-hmm.
right. I'm I'm working. My work now is to create financial products as opposed to physical products, which
Okay.
is what I was doing before, and I'm still doing. Uh, but financial products that support this resource transfer work.
Nice. I like
Um,
that. Okay.